Hey guys, it's Tori, and today I'm going to be discussing a fascinating topic for me, and that is Hardy's thoughts on marriage, at least how he portrays it and how I interpret it in his novels. So originally I was actually considering just doing a video just on marriage and Victorian literature in general, but I kind of was struggling to narrow down specifically what I wanted to say about it because I just think there's a lot of thoughts going on in a lot of Victorian novels on marriage and the concept of marriage. And so I wasn't really sure how best to do it. And then a couple months ago, Kate Howe made a comment in one of her videos. I think it was the one where she had Kieran from Katie Books read Wives and Daughters. But she mentioned the idea that Hardy hates marriage. And I'm not going to necessarily dispute that because I think there's definitely an argument to be made for that. But I think it's a little simplified to say that he hates marriage. So I thought maybe I'd do a video discussing how Hardy approaches marriage, because I think of all the authors I've read so far, Hardy's the one who seems most focused on marriage in a lot of his stories, not just like getting his characters married, but asking the question, what makes a happy marriage? Is it possible to have a happy marriage? And it makes a lot of sense that this would be such a huge focus in his books because he had such a hard time in his own marriages, and I don't know a lot of details on that, so I'm not going to go into his personal life much. I'm just going to be focusing on his novels for this video. But I do know enough to know that he did have a difficult time in both his marriages, but during the time when he was writing his novels, he just was within his first marriage. And so I'm sure that really impacted why he explored this topic so much. So, due to the nature of this video, I want to make clear that there will be some mild spoilers for several of Hardy's novels, and I'll go through them right now. I'm going to be as vague as possible, but because we're talking about marriages, and I'm going to have to address specifically how marriages kind of end up in different books, again, I'll keep it vague. I won't mention names, I won't mention specifics as much as possible, but it's likely something I say will cause you to predict what ends up happening if you ever pick up these novels. So just keep that in mind going in. I'll name off the 7 novels that I'll be talking about during this video so you know. So I'll be discussing Far from the Madding Crowd, Desperate Remedies, The Trumpet Major, Under the Greenwood Tree, The Woodlanders, The Hand of Ethelberta, and Jude the Obscure. So any of those 7 books, there may be mild spoilers in this or things I say that will cause you to predict the endings of those books, but I will be holding each one up singly, so if you want to skip those portions while I'm holding up those specific books, feel free to. But anyway, let's just get right into this. So like I said, it's common to consider Hardy as being a hater of marriage, and I think especially if you read Jude the Obscure, you tend to think that way, although I'll get to that book later on in the video. But I think Hardy's feelings are a lot more complex. His relationship with marriage is very complex, and I think we see this through the fact that he does discuss marriage so much in all his books. In fact, I had to narrow down his books, his oeuvre of novels, because I was like, I really could talk about all of them and how the marriages are portrayed in all of them if I wanted to, but I didn't want to overwhelm things and I wanted to keep to points as opposed to the novels themselves. So we narrowed it down to the 7. And the first point I want to make is I feel like Hardy recognizes that marriage just requires a little bit more thought and kind of a reality check before going into, because it's a lifetime. You're being with this person for a lifetime and it's legally binding. It's not just deciding to be with them. You are legally binding yourself to this person, and Hardy seems to consider a lot of how intense that is and how big of a decision that is, and recognizes that often maybe people don't take the time to consider how big of a choice that is. In fact, one of the points he seems to make in a couple of his novels is that marriage, the decision to get married, should take time. You should be able to really get to know the person you're marrying and really, take the time to consider what makes you complementary as opposed to just being in passionate love. And so there's a couple books I want to mention that sort of show this point that Hardy makes in multiple of his novels, like I said, but these 2 are the ones I'm going to specifically address. First of all, Far from the Madding Crowd. So in Far from the Madding Crowd, again, I'll keep it as vague as possible for those who haven't read this, but basically Bathsheba Everdeen has multiple suitors. She has 3 suitors in particular that she is considering. And the first one that's introduced is introduced right at the beginning of the novel, and they start a sort of relationship, and in fact, he ends up proposing to her. I'm just gonna say that it's very early on in the book. He proposes to her and she turns him down. And over time, we're able to see this comparison between that relationship and how it grows and develops and changes over time, and these other relationships that are driven a little bit more by passion. Now, one of these other relationships is driven more by passion just on the man's side. And then there's a third relationship that is driven by passion on both sides. And we're able to see the contrast between these different romances. And it is quickly made clear, I won't tell you how, but it is quickly made clear that the one that is driven by passion on both sides, and there's not much time, in fact, they move very quickly in that relationship, it causes a lot more heartache, and Bathsheba quickly realizes that she made a mistake by engaging in that relationship. Whereas this other one that starts from the very beginning, there's even a moment where they could have gotten married very early on, and yet she turns him down, and allowing that time seems to make that relationship work better. It's almost like, I would say, if they had gotten married right at the beginning, if that passion-driven, fast romance had occurred, it likely would have been a lot less successful than it might have been later on. And you're able to really compare and contrast as specifically Bathsheba develops throughout the novel. We're able to see her gain a better understanding of herself and what she would want in a relationship. And that time allows her to find more success in the future. So hard to be vague and still provide evidence of my point, but if you've read this, you know exactly what I'm saying, and if you haven't, maybe you can guess what I'm trying to say. It definitely shows that time has a strong positive impact on the way her relationships work out, and the less time they have, the more passionately driven they are, the less successful they tend to be. And I think it's fascinating, honestly, how Hardy explores that, especially in this book. If you haven't read this, definitely pick it up. But the other book I want to mention that also does this is Desperate Remedies. Now, for some of you who have read this, you may be surprised that I'm bringing this up compared to what I explored while discussing Far From the Madding Crowd for this video. But the difference with this one is, compared to the other novels, this is one of the few that has a romance that really works out pretty well in the end. There's a lot of other romances in Hardy novels that it's hard to tell how successful they'll be, and there's some that look like they probably won't be successful. But this one stands out as one where the romance actually is a pretty successful one that is based in a lot of ways on passionate feelings. I'll mention some later on that maybe aren't based as much on passionate feelings. But this one is one where it's based on passionate feelings and it's successful, but the thing that I think makes it successful that this book explores is the fact that, again, there's time. There's a long time where these two people are able to develop and come closer together and really explore their relationship and what it has to offer and make sure it's really what they want. They have some hang-ups along the way, of course, but we're able to see that this time that is taken to explore these two characters really does a lot for their relationship, and to allow the characters to explore each other and understand a lot about each other so that they know exactly what they're getting into by marrying each other. I just think Hardy notices that time allows people to get past the initial romantic feelings and dig deeper into a more realistic perspective. And I think that does occur in this, especially because during that time, while it's not only taking time to get to know each other, it's also giving time for other things to happen that could act as roadblocks, and do in some ways in this book. But they're able to overcome those roadblocks, and they're able to recognize that they can do it together, and they've been through these things, and so there's no reason to doubt that they'll be able to be successful. And I think that's really interesting that Hardy brings that up, especially because these two, Far From the Madding Crowd and Desperate Remedies, are some of his earlier novels. I think we can kind of see a development of his changing perspective on marriage, starting again with this idea that maybe taking more time would provide a better opportunity for success, But as he grew older, it seems that he started having some other thoughts on marriage and what might make it successful. And so the second point I want to discuss, I'm going to be discussing 4 books, 2 that are successful and 2 that have unsuccessful romances or seemingly potentially unsuccessful marriages. And I think the point Hardy makes in these 4 novels that I'm about to mention is that if romance is based on passion alone, the chances of it succeeding are very low. And those that are based on more companionship and maybe other things are able to be more successful because there's a more realistic perspective that's involved when you're marrying someone for other reasons other than passion. And so I think that's also a really interesting thing to think about, especially during a time when arranged marriages were more common than they are now in the Western world. I don't think Hardy would necessarily say arranged marriage is good, but I think he would argue that, again, there's a little bit more of a reality check involved in an arranged marriage. You're able to really think logically before taking those steps a little bit more, and so you're more prepared to do what needs to be done to make a marriage work, perhaps. So the first novel I want to talk about for this is The Hand of Ethelberta by Thomas Hardy. Now, this one is one of my favorites. I really enjoy it. But the way marriages occur in this story, I gotta be so vague with this, it's so hard. But the way marriages occur in this story is pretty unexpected and surprising, definitely unpredictable in a lot of ways. And let's just say Ethelberta does not end up necessarily with the person you would expect her to. So again, mild spoiler, but she ends up with someone, again, pretty surprising, and yet in the end of the story it almost suggests that she does end up finding some level of happiness in this marriage. Unlike a couple other books I'll mention later where the individual ended up with who they maybe had more affection for and it maybe didn't work out quite as well. So very interesting to see that contrast, and I'll again mention those novels in a moment. But what seems to make Ethelberta happy is the fact that she's able to logically see her future, recognize she has to do some work in order to find happiness because she clearly doesn't really feel passionate feelings for this man. And so in order to have happiness, she knows she has to create it for herself. She can't expect him to provide that for her because she doesn't love him. She's not romantically in love with him. And so she does just that, and she takes time in her life to really consider what will make her happy in this situation, and she basically creates her own happiness. She does what she can to find contentment in this new situation, and she's able to do it because she's thinking logically. Again, it goes between logically and passionately, and because the logic is higher than the passion in this marriage, she's able to find some level of happiness. And it's really interesting. This is one of the best parts about this book, is honestly how things end up, because it's so unpredictable and yet it inspires a lot of thought. I don't know how many people would actually like it, but I enjoyed it, and again, it caused me a lot of consideration on this topic, on how Hardy discusses marriage, and I think it's done really well in this book to show that, again, marriage is a really big decision, and a lot of thought needs to go into it over just feeling. Otherwise, if it's just driven by feeling, the chances of success are a lot lower because you're not, forever is a long time. A lifetime is a long time. So it needs to be considered in light of that. And I think this book shows that a marriage built on something other than passion really can thrive better because of that fact. A little bit different situation is in The Woodlanders, also by Hardy, and this is a case where there is some level of passion in the beginning of this marriage, and it does cause problems. Again, I'm not going to get too deep into it, but essentially it does cause problems in this novel, and I think there's some level of hope that this marriage will just end somehow, like a certain someone would die, or somehow they're able to get a divorce and it works out, despite the fact this is in the Victorian era. But it doesn't necessarily work out like that. And we're able to see that over time, because this marriage, though partially based on passion on one side of the marriage, on the other side of the marriage, there was a lot more reason going in, a lot more logical thinking. There's a little bit of family pressure, and that's kind of why this individual follows through on this marriage despite their misgivings. But because this individual has some level of reality and logic going into this marriage, they're almost more prepared to deal with the problems that arise and to overcome them given time. And so by the end of this book, we're able to see that there's no guarantee it's going to be a success, but we can see that both partners are willing to work at it a little bit more than they did in the beginning. And so there's some slight semblance of hope that maybe this marriage, despite its rocky start, will be a success given the partners both being willing again to continue to work at it and to continue to improve themselves, not only for their own sake, but for the sake of the other person. Again, it's a very vague ending. You're not totally sure how things are going to work out, but there is a conversation between some members of the village where this occurs that suggests that there is some level of hope, even if there's not a guarantee. And I think that's a really another interesting point regarding marriage, as a slight tangent, that you just don't know how a marriage is going to end up. You can't guarantee anything, but you can have some level of hope, and you can have that dedication and willingness to try. And if both parties have that, they're much more likely to succeed, and that this book explores that really well. And again, explores that idea of a marriage being based not solely on passion, but also having some realistic, logical thinking involved that makes a marriage successful in the long run. In comparison to those two, there are some books that show the opposite, where the marriage ends up occurring between the more passionately involved lovers and does not occur with maybe the one that would have added a little bit more reality. And there's a question as to whether there will be success. So the first book I want to mention for this is Under the Greenwood Tree by Thomas Hardy. Now this one, if you've read it, you may be questioning my response a little bit. Maybe you won't, but I would say that this marriage, the marriage that ends up occurring in this book, does not have a lot of promise. And the reason why is because of certain events that occur towards the end, just before the marriage, that suggest that this marriage is being driven a lot by passion, and that there's not been a lot of reality considerations gone into it. It seems throughout the book that they are considering the reality of the situation, that they are thinking logically, but thinking back, once you reach the end and you see what ends up happening, you recognize that maybe they were driven primarily by feelings and passions and emotions, as opposed to really thinking things through, especially on the female side, I will say that. And it makes you question, once you reach the end of this, whether or not this marriage is actually for the best, if it's going to be successful, because there seems to be another option within this story that could have come up that maybe could have provided more happiness if, again, more thought had gone into their marriage and more consideration on the woman's part and on the man's part had been gone into on their different backgrounds, their different personalities, their different levels of education, and how that might influence their future together, especially after more than a few months, once the passion begins to fade. I actually am taking a psychology class right now where we have discussed recently how passionate feelings usually fade after at most 2 years. And so marriages based on that sort of love tend to fail pretty quickly. And I think this shows a level of that in this book, which is really unfortunate, because this book is very interesting because it does have a sweet story, and yet the ending just, again, it's just, there's a slight melancholy to it. It quickly becomes apparent that maybe this sweet, happy story won't have the greatest ending because, again, a lifetime is a long time. Another book that does this in a much more obvious way, I think, than Under the Greenwood Tree is The Trumpet Major. So this one is interesting because our main female character is actually choosing between two brothers, and they're brothers who have similarities but a lot of differences in their personality. And I think it's easy to see that the decision she ends up making maybe isn't the best decision, that it's highly likely, and it's suggested in the end that it's highly likely that she's going to be very hurt in that marriage because it was based primarily on passion. And this is an interesting one, going back to my point earlier about a longer time to really get to know each other and how that really impacts success. This one's interesting because with both of these brothers, in fact, with the one that maybe isn't the best choice, she's had a bit of a longer interaction with in a lot of ways. It's been broken up by a few years of separation and things, but she's been around him longer, but they haven't gone beyond passion. They've stuck with passion. Whereas this other brother, she's able to have a little bit more time to develop more of a friendship with him and get to know him in a different way than she does with his brother. And it leads me to believe, at least, that that would have been a much more successful marriage if it had been allowed to happen than the one that she ends up in. And that one, despite, again, the fact that she loves this brother more, she has more passionate feelings for him, he clearly is the wrong choice. And again, we see that throughout this book, that he's clearly not the right choice. And unfortunately, that choice leads to pretty tragic consequences at the end of this book. Again, won't share specific thoughts on that because I don't want to spoil it for anyone, even though what I've said might be a minor spoiler already. So anyway, the contrast between these two brothers definitely hits home to me, that idea of having some reality and logic and having a marriage based on companionship as opposed to passionate feelings really has an impact on the success of a marriage, at least according to what Hardy seems to be portraying in his novels. And then we get to Jude the Obscure, which I am currently not quite done with. I should actually finish today. I think I'm in part 6 of it. And I have under 100 pages left to read. So keep that fact in mind that I haven't finished this yet as I discuss it. But I think I've read enough to get an idea of how marriage is being approached in this book. And I would say this is Hardy at his most cynical when it comes to marriage. And it's interesting that this is his last novel because I do feel like there's some level of him getting more and more cynical with marriage throughout his novels as he continued to write them. And in this, he is definitely very cynical of it, but I also feel like there's two arguments going on in here, and I think it's probably both arguments he probably considered a lot. And it's an argument of, am I just made different and so therefore I can't be happy in marriage, but happiness in marriage is possible? Or is happiness in marriage just not possible and society is lying to itself if it thinks it is? And I think there's some level of that because, I mean, he can't go through life not seeing happy marriages. Like, there's enough happy marriages in the world that he can't have not seen any. He had to have noticed marriages that he seemed to consider to seem happy at least, but he clearly did not have a happy marriage. And so there's almost this sense, I mean, Jude and Sue are the main love interests throughout this story, the main characters in this story. And both of them come from the same family, they're cousins, and so they have a family history of marriages not working out. And so they discuss a lot how maybe their family isn't made for marriage. Maybe they just, again, aren't made like other people. And Jude seems to be the one that believes that more. He also seems to believe that it's possible for them to be happy, they just have to find the right person. And Sue, on the other hand, seems to think that just all marriages don't work out, that everybody's not as happy in marriage as they claim to be, and that marriage is just an institution that's ridiculous and should go away. And it's actually kind of frustrating for me to read because there's a lot of discussion between them about, especially on Sue's side, about the idea of they're happy, like, just being lovers, and as soon as they get married, what if they no longer love each other? And to me, I'm just like, why can't you just choose not to let the fact that you signed a paper and made it legal that you're together, that you're legally bound to each other, like, why can't you decide not to let that impact your feelings for each other and to fight to make sure you're taking care of each other and still loving each other despite the fact that maybe it feels confining to you for some reason, that you're legally bound to that person for life. Anyway, I don't agree with it, I will say that. But I do think it's interesting that Hardy clearly got to a point where he was debating on whether marriage was even possible to be happy in, but he wasn't at the point, at least in this novel, as far as I can tell from this novel, that he believed that marriages really were completely just not going to work, which would make sense considering this was before his first wife died and he ended up getting remarried after she died. So clearly he wasn't completely averse to marriage because he did get remarried again. And so I think he's just very critical of the fact that society doesn't allow for dissolution of unhappy marriages. And I think you can see that in Tess as well. And I think he's just really trying to figure out if happiness in marriage is possible. And I know this book ends tragically, so I'm kind of assuming this book is going to lead into maybe a saying of happiness in marriage is very unlikely. I could be wrong. I don't know how the tragedy ends up unfolding, obviously, because I haven't read it yet. But at least so far, it seems like there's a debate between two sides of Hardy as to whether or not happiness in marriage is possible, and whether or not it's possible for him, maybe possible for an individual who maybe is part of a family that none of them seem to be happy in marriage. And so it's a really interesting discussion in this, kind of frustrating again, like I said, because I will say I'm one that believes that happiness in marriage is possible for everyone who wants to get married. I just think it takes a lot of work, and you have to remember that those passionate emotions, like I mentioned earlier, are going to fade over time, and you need to be able to develop that companionable friendship almost with your spouse as well, so that you're both willing and dedicated to continue to develop yourself and continue to work together to make things work. So anyway, that's my thoughts on it, but I think Hardy was really struggling with coming to terms with his own unhappy marriage and the fact that he's not sure if happiness in marriage is possible. I feel like I'm rambling now, so I'll just stop. But I hope you enjoyed this discussion. Please feel free to make any comments you would like in the comment section down below. If you disagree with me, if you agree with me, feel free. I mean, you know, always be respectful. That's all I ask. But I'm very curious to hear what your thoughts are on Hardy and marriage. And again, I think it's very possible Hardy did end up hating marriage, but I think there's an argument to be made that it was more complex than that, basically, and that he just had a very complex view of marriage and recognized its importance, but also recognized how big of an impact it made to get married, and it really changed your life, and especially at a time when you couldn't get divorced very easily. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you would like to. Happy Victober, and I will see you next time. Bye!